All right. So those of you who are here, hopefully we can make this time valuable. Do a little bit of review. I'll probably go over some specific questions, and I'll kind of just outline like what I think you should know for the final, which I've got it written, so I might have a good insight into that. And then we'll kind of just go from there. So any questions? So logistics wise, it looked kind of similar to that final set of the final exam practice, not the additional problems. It's going to be about 10 multiple choice and then about 5 short answer with a couple different parts involved. So I'll go through what I think would be really good to know afterwards, but we'll kind of work through a few more of those additional practice problems since you don't have an answer key. I don't have an answer key posted for that one. After tonight, you wanted to do that kind of replacement homework, that fifth one. Remember, I said I'm going to drop the lowest, so you didn't do it. It'll just be whatever your grade was in the first 4 homeworks. If you do it and it's better than one of your other ones, it kind of swaps that one out. I'll get that answer key posted tomorrow. All right. So after the due date is passed, I've got it ready to go. So I've got it scanned. I'll just put it up on Canvas tomorrow. So you'll have that as an additional study tool as well. So those homeworks 3, 4, and 5 are all going to be kind of good ones to use to study for the final. As well as those practice exam and additional practice problems. It's 2 hours to take the exam, if I remember correctly, and I think I forgot to pull open the syllabus for this class. Got my other 2 right, so you guys should be, I believe Wednesday at noon is our final for this class. I think I pointed it out last class as well, but just to hammer it home. Yeah, so noon on Wednesday, we'll have 2 hours. I don't think time on the exam should be an issue. I'll kind of bring in extra paper if you want it. Other than that, should be kind of the logistics side of the exam. Any questions for me on that before we move on? I don't know when I'll get any of those people who did the physics homework. I don't know when I'll exactly get those graded. Hopefully, I have a lot of time Sunday to grade. And Monday I've got a little, so hopefully I'll be able to kind of get those grades updated on Canvas so that you can kind of see what your score was with the lowest dropped, similar to kind of what I did with that iClicker score. Okay. Other than that, questions from me before we jump into things here. Okay. So we'll look at these additional practice final questions, I guess I called it. So the one that I don't think we worked through last class, and if we did, correct me, but I don't think we did this women's soccer where we had discrimination from consumers going on. So I think we worked through every other one on this practice set of additional problems, because we did the European kind of US stuff. We did the union monopoly stuff. We went through the roster caps. We did these contract zones. I think I talked a little bit about on problem 1, 2. So this should be the last one that we have to go through. Let's assume we have identical supply and demand for labor for men's and women's soccer. Right? So we're assuming that, this demand curve for labor, if we've got the same supply of male and female players and quality is the same. Remember, the demand curve for labor is composed of what? Marginal revenue per win times the number of additional wins that player is going to bring in. Okay? So if we're assuming that the demand curves are the same for the same quality players, what we're really assuming was the marginal revenue per win is the same across men's and then women's soccer. So if we start out with that assumption, we should be in this scenario that looks something like this, right? So we've got our supply curve for labor for men is the same as that of women. And we said for the same quality player, it should be that we've kind of got the same demand curve. Okay. However, if we have consumer discrimination, and I think the question asks, what's going to happen in the kind of win market, but also what's going to happen. Actually, here, let's see how I want to make sure I give you the exact definition of what it was. So scroll up here. So depict what we would expect to see happen in the market for soccer games. So kind of the product market, and then what would happen in the labor market as well. So this consumer discrimination doesn't start out in the labor market. It actually starts out down here in the product market. And we could think about things like even what's true about the ticket market. Right?
So let's say I've got some demand curve for games. Let's say I've got my capacity. Let's say I'm just hitting capacity. So I've got my quantity and I've got kind of the price. Right? Well, what's going to happen if I have consumer discrimination is essentially it's the consumer's benefit of watching that game, but now they kind of have this additional cost if that game has players that they discriminate against playing. Right? So what we're going to see would be like, I'll draw kind of an extreme example. So this is D1, so D2. Here, this is going to be a weird one. If we didn't have monopoly power, we actually could get driven down. The price actually gets driven down to zero. Now we know that there's probably monopoly power. We can kind of make this a little more complicated, but really all we need to see here, because it would be the same implications if we had twice as steep marginal revenue, we would still see the quantity and the price both go down from this demand curve decrease. And it wasn't so much a demand curve decrease. It was like, here's what demand is with this additional, this one didn't have the cost. So I would want to think about this one was like the original marginal benefit, but they also had this additional discrimination cost. Right? So in the product market, it kind of pushes down that demand curve. So if you think about the product, you think about the number of games played, but we can also think about the ticket market, right? All these different revenue sources. If I have lower price and lower quantity, what's going to happen to be true about my marginal revenue? Well, total revenue is price times quantity. So price and quantity both go down. My total and my marginal revenue are going to decrease, right? So if I have a decrease, so here was my kind of product or ticket market that showed I'm going to lose some revenue from each win, right? In fact, if I didn't do the ticket market, just to really hammer this idea home and relate these two, let's say I was looking at the wins market, and this is where we usually use this kind of constant marginal cost. This is going back a ways. We've got demand, marginal revenue. So this would be like demand plus discrimination. This is going to be then the marginal revenue plus discrimination. Demand, marginal revenue should be way out here. So we can kind of see we've got this decrease in the marginal revenue per win. Right? So if that's the case, right, this consumer discrimination, it's going to push down the marginal revenue per win from women's soccer if there's discrimination at the consumer level against women. So instead, even though demand should be this high, the demand, let's keep this consistent, sorry, women and men's, right? So this is going to be like plus kind of whatever that consumer discrimination that decreased the marginal revenue per win. So we're now going to see that the wage women are paid in equilibrium, it's going to be less than the wage men are paid, right? And we will see whatever group that consumer base was discriminating against, they're going to have a lower quantity of workers hired as well, right? Or they're going to supply less labor hours. Any questions on this idea? So we're just kind of, they're trying to make the connection that the initial change from consumer discrimination happens in the product market, right? Or happens in the win, right? It's decreasing kind of the demand and marginal revenue for that, whatever group is being discriminated against. As a result, that decreases the marginal revenue per win, which subsequently decreases the demand coming from that person's labor, right? Whoever's being discriminated against. Any questions here before we keep moving? Okay with this? So another good thing or something I could do. So let's say I tell you we've got consumer discrimination, right? What would be let's say I have this consumer discrimination, but I still see female players earning more. So if I know for a second that the demand curve should be the same between men and women's sport, they're getting the same marginal revenue per win, but I have consumer discrimination going on against women. But when I look at the data, I still see the average wage for women to be higher. What would have to be true? If I've assumed that the marginal revenue per win is the same across both without the discrimination, well, I know discrimination should push the women's wages lower. What's the only way, or what's something that would combat that? If women were on average providing a higher quality of play, right? higher marginal number of wins, right? So if our kind of like, we think about quality differences between male and female soccer players, if female soccer players are on average of higher quality, potentially that difference, right, would cause the demand curve to shift. So maybe it's like, yeah, here's the discrimination, but then the difference in quality makes up a huge gap, right? So you could still get, and we kind of think about this, was like this scenario where they had a higher marginal wins coming from there. So even with the discrimination, like, I'll draw this out on a different graph, just to make it a little bit more clear, because this is an important point. And I probably wouldn't do this with them. It probably would be like players within the same sport, but we can do the male female thing here. So it should be, so we've got this demand curve for males, and if women were of higher quality, they should have a higher demand curve, right? Well, we've assumed that the supply is the same, right? So it should be that they're earning a higher wage, right? But how could they earn a higher wage even with discrimination? Well, even with discrimination, if it only shifted my demand curve for females down a little bit, I could still see the wage for women here being larger than the wage for men, right? So kind of having these multiple shifts is something I might do where I say, okay, look, you know, this group on average is higher quality, right? Or I could even do something like large and small markets, right? So large and small markets, we know, would have differences in their demand curves. So kind of think about writing this out. We know the marginal revenue per win is higher in large markets, right? So even if I'm holding constant the quality of the player, I know larger markets will always have higher demand curves. I think I did this on homework 4, where I used the large and small market example and then said, okay, you know, instead of the quality driving the difference here, it would be that the large markets are paying more. But then if there's discrimination in the large market, right, that would shift that demand curve down. Whether or not it's consumer or employer discrimination, that's shifting our demand curve. We said employee discrimination, we looked at some examples last class, that was what will shift my supply curve. So I can kind of have this combination of the two, either differences in demand curves because of the marginal revenue per win, that's like a large versus small market thing. I could also have differences in demand curve because one group has a higher marginal wins from coming from their labor. That's the example I used here. Then even with discrimination, if that difference in quality is greater than the discrimination, right? Demand shift up is going to be greater than demand shift back down. You could still end up seeing that discriminated group still earning a higher wage. It's just not as. So actually, this should be with discrimination. Here is what the wage should be, right? So even though they're still getting paid more, it's not as, you know, high as what it should be. Any questions on this idea of combining these multiple, like discrimination with things that are going to be also shifting the demand curve? And anytime you have this happen, so anytime I use like some discrimination example, and then I combine that with either differences in quality or differences in marginal revenue, like a large versus small market, anytime you have two things shifting to the demand curve, the ultimate answer is always going to be, it depends on the size of the discrimination, right? Depends on the size of the discrimination relative to the size of the gap in quality or relative to the size of the gap in the marginal revenue per win. Okay? So sometimes the answer will be, it depends. I might even ask you, depict one scenario where discrimination would push wages, or draw one scenario where discrimination, the wages could still remain above the non-discriminated against group. Depict another one where discrimination would push wages below. And all that would be, right, it's just like a huge decrease in demand, right? Like a really large kind of shift from that discrimination going on, pushing that wage far below. Other questions on that? What's that problem? Okay. Let me think what's probably the most advantageous. So like I said, believe we've covered everything on this one. I will just outline, I think, things that I would make sure I know and that I'm studying. One Now, a lot of these are captured in those final practice problems, like, or the,
What is the file called? I keep. Look, final exam practice problems. Yeah. So a lot of this will be covered in those.
but some of it might be stuff that was covered in homework questions, right? So if I'm studying and I'm thinking about what topics or what problems I want to make sure I know how to do. We go back, I think, when we looked at this last class, but knowing how to solve a model where you have monopsony power, right? And then also, how do you solve a model in the labor market where you've got the union acting like a monopoly, right? So both of these, right, are going to be kind of in the context of our labor market. So we did this last class. We worked through some, when I say know what these do, like, I could draw that the monopsony is going to cause them to make a decision with a twice as steep marginal expenditure curve, but they know players will play for this lower wage, right? So the monopsony power is like the team is the only employer. So I know that's going to push down wages and would also kind of push down quantity, right, from where it would be at if it was in perfect competition. So maybe for a multiple choice, I might just ask something about there exists monopsony power. What's the what's going to be true about the wage the monopsonist chooses relative to a perfectly competitive market? But I could also make this a short answer, more likely what I'm going to do, kind of like the practice problem we worked through on Wednesday, which was giving you some actual, equations for demand and then for supply. And then this one would be, let's do like 200 minus 4Q, right? So this was, I'll give you a supply and demand equation. If you know there's monopsony power, you know that marginal expenditure would just be twice as steep as my supply curve, right? So here was my supply curve. Here's my demand curve. We worked through kind of a problem with actual numbers like this last class. I also said, make sure you know how to solve for what wage the monopolist would choose. There we have monopolized the labor market, or we have this union where that's the only place you can hire players from. Then the union's going to set the quantity of workers at this level where marginal revenue is equal to kind of our supply or our marginal cost curve. Remember, marginal revenue, an example of this, it's just going to be our demand curve, but twice as steep. Once I have that quantity, I plug that into my demand curve for the union who's acting like a monopolist. And I know that the value of the players to those teams is wherever we're at in the demand curve, so we can get away with charging teams whatever that value is. All right. So monopolies or unions in the labor market will increase the wage. Monopsonists, where the team is the only employer, should drive the wage down. Right? So know how to kind of draw these as well as kind of solve them with some actual functions here. Linear functions. I'll never give you anything crazy, like only the stuff we've ever looked at. Okay.
Any questions on the idea yet?
So I would know how to do that. I would also know how to think about, and there's a couple of different problems that we worked through on Tuesday. There's also some additional ones in the practice problems we haven't worked through yet, but I would know how to go through and solve those contract zone questions, thinking about scenarios where you have optimism. I don't know how to spell this. Pessimism. Whatever, however you spell pessimism, right? Optimistic and pessimistic beliefs, how those can kind of take a contract zone where you actually had a range where values, where there was some overlap in the threat points, right? We could come to an agreement anywhere in this range. But if we had someone who was overly pessimistic about what the other side needed, they may think that an agreement can't be made, right? And so depending on the scenario, right, if we ever have kind of the union would not accept kind of the terms based off of the optimism or pessimism, then this is going to be a scenario where we see a strike. We said if the league ever kind of has this idea that they're not going to accept, they have optimism or pessimism that believes that there's no range that they'll accept that the other side wants, well, that's when we're going to see kind of this lockout, right? We also talked about a less extreme example last class, which is, oh, I don't know. Let's say they're agreeing upon, I don't know, maximum contract values or something, right? These contract, like Lamar just signed for 260 yesterday or something. All right, so maybe the league's like, yeah, we have an end threat point, right? We can't give out contracts more than 300. The union's like, well, these players should never be getting paid less than 200, these higher quality players. So let's say that instead, they're not overly pessimistic, right? This is the league here, and this was kind of the union. Let's say the league thinks the union won't accept anything below 260. Well, what's the negative outcome that this is going to have? Well, the league, if they want to get a deal done, they're like, well, now we think we can only get a deal somewhere in this range. Even if they propose 260, what's going to be true is that, oh yeah, the union will definitely accept that, but they could have gotten away with offering something like 210, and the union would have. So these kind of overly pessimistic beliefs, whoever is pessimistic, it can reduce their surplus, right? Now, if it gets to be too extreme, we said, not only is it reducing their surplus, it might lead them to just exiting negotiations altogether, right? If the league gets overly pessimistic about the union, they might have a lockout and say, we're just not going to come to an agreement. We think that you're way above what we want, right? Any questions on this before we keep moving? Okay. So I would know how to kind of go through those. I would know how to think about the following. So we already worked through some of this, but so consumer discrimination. So we kind of talked through this where you know it's going to impact the product market, right? So you're going to have a reduction in the marginal revenue per win, which then kind of causes the demand curve for whatever group is being discriminated against, demand curve for labor to also decrease, right? So consumer discrimination, when we look at the labor market, it's going to cause there to be differences in demand for different players, right? Whoever is discriminated against versus not. We also know that employer discrimination is also going to cause, I'm trying to talk before I is also going to cause demand to be lower, right? So consumer and employer discrimination basically are just saying that the value of the player to the team, right? It's whatever it should be, but plus some of this additional kind of discrimination cost, right? Whether or not that cost is to the employers themselves or just that they would lose out on money from consumers. Now, one thing that we want to make sure we think about when we're thinking about discrimination, I think there's a question on the practice exam like this, and I think there's one in the homework as well. So let's say that I've got all my teams are discriminating. What would be true about the wage? Let's say I identify that the value of that player at perfectly, if it was a perfectly competitive labor market, is, I don't know, $30 million. With this discrimination, right? What can I say? If every single team is discriminating, what do I know is going to be true about the wage that these groups who are discriminated against is going to get? It's going to have to be less than 30 million, right? It's pushing that wage down. Okay? So if every single team is discriminatory, I'll see the wages of my discriminated group be lower. What if there's, so all teams discriminatory, wages will be lower for the discriminated against player. What if I have one non-discriminatory team, right? So I go from everybody being discriminatory to everybody being discriminatory except for one team. Now what's going to be true about the wage that the discriminated player gets? Well, let's say instead of just less than 30, let's say I thought this was going to be 20 million. There's just one non-discriminating team. What's the equilibrium wage of this discriminated against group? Theoretically, the person would be indifferent, if I offered them 20 million, right? I have no competition. What will probably play out in practice, I'd probably be offered a wage that was just slightly above that, right? Just a little bit above 20 million, right? Because I'm the only non-discriminating team, I'm willing to pay them up to 30, right? However, I've got no competition. I'm the only non-discriminatory team. I'm the only team willing to pay them 30. Every other team is only going to pay them 20. So I'll offer them something just barely above that, right? And I'm still going to have like a huge net positive, right? Because the value of the player is still significantly high to me. Now, what if I end up with even just 2 non-discriminatory teams? Well, now I've got 2 teams that value the player at 30. Team A maybe offers 21. Team B then offers 22. Team A offers 23. Basically, you'll kind of end up with the wage of the discriminated group going back up kind of to what it should be, right? It goes all the way back up to where we were at on that demand curve without the discrimination, or in this case, we know they'd be getting paid that value they had to the team of 30 million. So no, depending on how many discriminatory teams we have, what's going to happen to that equilibrium wage for the discriminated against group. Okay. And there's really 3 scenarios. All discriminatory, they definitely end up with this lower wage. One non-discriminatory, lower wage, but it's a little bit higher, right? They had to attract them away from a non-discriminatory team, and they were willing to pay a much higher wage, so they just barely do it a small increment. As long as we have at least 2 non-discriminating teams, that should be enough competition to get that wage back up to whatever the value of that player is to these non-discriminatory teams. Any questions on that before you keep moving? All right. So what's the only type of discrimination I've left off? Wait, consumer, employer. Yeah, so know how to think about employee discrimination. So this was basically supply curve shifts, right? So anytime we have quantity of labor, right, we've got supply curve, demand curve, right? So this is non-discriminatory employees, right? We said we always think about supply as marginal cost. So if I've got an employee who's discriminatory towards a certain group, basically I'm increasing the cost at every single quantity of labor to them. So the supply curve with this discrimination is like whatever the old marginal cost was, plus some additional cost of discrimination, right? They're playing with something in that group. So here we're going to see shifts kind of in that supply curve when we have employee discrimination. Okay. Any questions on that idea? So one thing I might combine with this, and this kind of hits at another scenario. So we're thinking more about like the NCAA stuff we were talking about. I might do something where I then said, okay, look, I could do different supply shifts as well, right? So just like before, when I said, we could have discrimination and differences in quality or differences in small versus large market. Maybe I give you an example where I've got discriminatory employees, right? A shift in the supply curve. But then I also tell you, oh, what would it have to be? Something like, I could do it with some combination of like, is the city in which employees are, or the team in which the employees are discriminatory, is that an Ivy League school, right? If it is, right, I could think about, well, then here's this discrimination, but I know that relative to the non-Ivy League school, right, my supply curve should be a little bit lower, right? So that probably won't be quite that, maybe I can kind of show you here. So this was the idea that if I had like an Ivy League school and non-Ivy League school, we said that anytime we're looking at what our supply curve is, it should be the marginal cost of attending that university. So the marginal cost, if I could, assuming I'd have to give you that, you assume that they could get into either school, but going to a non-Ivy League school relative to an Ivy League school should make the costs higher, right? I'm foregoing an Ivy League education, so those costs are going to be higher at that non-Ivy League school. We also said another way we can think about these supply curve shifts are not just the value of the degree, but maybe the attractiveness of the area. So instead of like Ivy League school versus a non-Ivy League, maybe this was like, I don't know, big city versus a small city, right? Or Miami, supply curve for Miami relative to, I don't know, Minneapolis or something like that, right? Where you're thinking about going to a small city, going to somewhere where the weather's not as nice, somewhere where it doesn't have as high a degree of an education, your cost is what you're foregoing. The cost is I'm not going to an Ivy League school that has a high value. I'm not going to a city like Miami, which would have a really high utility value to me. I'm not going to like a larger city where there's more things for me to do, which has a huge value to me, right? So you can have supply curve shifts because of employee discrimination. You can also see those supply curve shifts just by what is that player foregoing by choosing to go to that team. Yeah.
What is the y-axis in that graph then?
Here?
Yeah.
So this is just the quantity of labor,
Yeah.
right? So we're still looking at kind of a labor market, right? Now we could combine these two. Probably wouldn't be that mean just because it's going to get pretty convoluted, but we do want to think about, we do have multiple things, employee discrimination, and these other factors that I often use as examples of what could shift the supply curve between the two. Any other questions on? So in relation to this idea of supply curve shifts, there's also something else would be a good thing to know, right? So we talked about this, whether or not college players were paid and whether or not there was this idea of the wages relative to tuition and things like that. So I think a lot of the examples that we looked through, we're thinking about like differences in sports. So for example, let's say I had like football and I don't know, tennis, right? And we said, well, we know that the demand curve for D1 football is going to be much higher than D1 tennis, which would result in kind of much higher equilibrium wages for football teams than for tennis teams, right? So a couple of the questions, some of you like did think about this in a good way, but if I'm thinking about these sports, I'll often in the final give you the assumption that the supply curves are the same. There's a really good argument that if I have a sport where there's more money to be made at the professional level, what might be true about the supply curve for that sport at the collegiate level? Well, if I can make $1 million, but I decide to play in college, my opportunity cost is giving up that $1 million, right? So a lot of you were thinking about this correct in one of the problems in homework 4, which is that you could see supply curve differences across different sports just because of the amount of money available at the professional level, right? For here, we're going to assume away that this is a player can't make it to professional level, right? So we don't have to worry about it at all. We've got the supply curve, same quality players. We're assuming that they're providing labor at the same level, right? So it has the same cost. So we know that the football wages would in equilibrium be higher. What's also more likely to be true is that if we're comparing those wages to the value of tuition, it's more likely that the football team would, right, be able to, the players would prefer a wage relative to the tuition, right? And also for the tennis team, the actual value that they would be paid if this was a free and open labor market, as opposed to being just offered a tuition remission, the tuition remission actually had a higher value. Now, sorry, any questions on that before I keep moving? So now I'll also point out, so you should be able to think about kind of this tuition amount relative to these different wages. The other thing that I wanted to review today was, if I allowed them to do a combination of these two, why would the school ever not decide to also give them a tuition remission? So we said there had to be two different qualities that were true for this tuition remission to basically be of zero cost to the university, right? So the one condition was that by offering this person a tuition remission, we're not replacing another student, right? Because as soon as that student athlete, this person we offer if they replace another student, well, that's someone we're going to be getting tuition from, right? So now by giving them that tuition remission, we're foregoing getting tuition from someone else. So if I did have like my enrollment capped, and by accepting this student athlete and giving them a tuition remission, I replaced another student who would have been paying, then my tuition is actually going to have a cost to me, right? So I need to not be replacing another student in order for tuition to have a zero cost. We also said the other scenario that we would need is that the player would not have attended without that tuition remission, Because if they would have attended my university, regardless of if I give them that tuition remission or not, well, now if I give them the tuition remission, they would have came anyways and paid the tuition. So now that's a cost to me as well. So as long as these two things are true, that you're not replacing another student and that the person would have not attended the university without the tuition remission, if these two scenarios are met, then this is kind of like the tuition would be zero cost to the university, right? So then there, I'd still pay the wage, and why not throw in the tuition remission as well? It's going to have a higher value to the player, and it costs me nothing additionally, right? Now, if offering that tuition remission as well, replace another student, or that student would be going to my university regardless, well, now I'm foregoing whatever that tuition amount is, right? I would have been earning that tuition amount had I not kind of given the remission. Any questions over the idea? I don't, like I said, we talked about that a while ago, but I wanted to kind of reiterate that. Thinking about these teams' decisions, wages relative to tuitions. You know, I also could have done, where did I put it? Something like this. So I've got differences in the demand curve. I could also think about when I have differences in my supply curve. So what school here, like Ivy League versus non-Ivy League, would be more likely to kind of offer tuition amounts? Well, this is where it could get tricky, right? Because what's probably true about the tuition remission of an Ivy League school relative to a Boston? Yeah, the value of their tuition at the Ivy League school is probably much greater than tuition at the non-Ivy, right? Well, because we know that in order to kind of pay, or sorry, to attract the player to the non-Ivy League school, this equilibrium wage for the non-Ivy League school would be greater than this equilibrium wage at the Ivy League. Ivy League can get away with paying less because the value of their tuition is so much. We'll also notice that, you know, that makes it even more likely the value of the tuition remission is greater than the wage the Ivy League school would pay. And it also makes it way more likely that the wage that the non-Ivy League school would pay is going to be greater than their tuition remission, right? So you could have this kind of combination of, yeah, we're going to have differences in this education value. It's going to shift our supply curve. But if the actual cost of that degree or the tuition amount varies between the two schools as well, well, then we might have kind of this, you know, something really similar to this, right? Where I know the tuition is going to be higher at the Ivy League school, but it's more valuable, so that supply curve is going to be much lower. The wage is most likely going to be less at the Ivy League school compared to their tuition amount. I know that for the non-Ivy League school, their supply curve is going to be much higher, right? Because they're foregoing these really good educations elsewhere. So that wage I'll have to pay them is pretty high, and they're a non-Ivy League school, so I know that it's more likely that their tuition amount is going to be a lot lower. So I can see from here, it's probably going to be more likely the Ivy League school, if given the choice, would offer a tuition remission. It's going to be much more valuable than the wage they would pay. The non-Ivy League school, much more likely to offer a wage because it's more likely that the amount's going to be greater than the tuition value to the player, student. Excuse me. Other questions on that? I know I'm going through stuff pretty quick, but I'm just trying to give you a taste of everything that would be kind of good to know here. Combining, I mean, like I said, combining some things here where I'll probably just individually look at them on the exam. So this is even, you know, more complicated than what I would ask you to do. The last, so we've got those discriminations, we have differences across the supply curves and demand curves coming from different sports at the collegiate level, comparing them tuition amounts. One theme that'll be kind of consistent through some of the problems on the exam. So I might use this idea of competitive balance, increasing demand for a sport, right? So I might even do something like, I think I did in a previous problem on Wednesday, where improvements in competitive balance would increase the demand for the sport overall, increasing the demand for the labor curve, pushing wages up for the player, right? So I might make that combination or the connection between competitive balance and then kind of the labor market. But the other thing that's very different than this, or that I'll expect a little bit more on, and you see this in the final exam practice problems, is I want you to do a little more stuff with linear regression. So in the 5th homework assignment, even if you didn't do it, look at the answer key there. So there was like a scenario where I said, okay, you're interested in the, I'll do one that's not in the homework. So let's say I'm interested in what is the impact Well, we could do a very basic one. What is the impact of some competitive balance measures? So maybe the standard deviation and wins. Well, let me make something easier here.
That's an easy one I can do.
Here we go. So maybe I'm trying to predict the length of a contract given to a player. And let's do quarterback. So passing touchdowns, maybe we've got rushing touchdowns, I don't know what their age is, etc. Right? So maybe I phrase the question, okay, you're interested in how teams are rewarding player performance, right? So you want to know monetarily what's the benefit? What are some variables you could use? Well, I could have used the actual salary, right? I could use length of the contract. I could use the average kind of annual amount they're getting paid. But I'm using some measure of how good the contract is, right? Here I'm thinking longer length is good. Right? Now I know that I'm also going to say, okay, how can I predict how good a contract is based off of the player's performance? Well, there I'm going to want to include different player performance metrics, right? How many passing touchdowns, maybe passing yards, right? Include, mention all these other variables that might be a good thing at predicting how long of a contract a player gets. One of them including like how old are they? Not going to give a 40-year-old a 10-year contract, right? And so I might set up kind of a question, like a generalized question. There won't be a hard and fast answer, right? But I might say, okay, what is a dependent variable that could measure how good a contract is? What is an independent variable or independent variables you think would be good at predicting kind of what that either the length of the contract, the contract amount is, right? Now, if I give you some regression output or I give you a equation like this, I'm also going to expect you to know how to interpret coefficients, how to determine if they are significant, right? And then we also talk a little bit about what's the value, but what's the how good of a kind of regression is this, right? So those three things. The first thing is going to be anytime we're trying to interpret a coefficient, right, it's going to be the effect, we can think about this way, of a 1 unit change in our x variable on the predicted value of y, right? So if x goes up, so actually I should say 1 unit change in x predicted value of y. So generally we'll have numbers here. So like for instance, let's say I was looking at this passing touchdown one. I would say 1 more passing touchdown. And let's say I told you that the value was, I don't know, 1.5. I don't know, that doesn't make sense. 0.2, right? So for every additional or 1 more passing touchdown, the length of the contract increases by whatever that coefficient value is, right? So I'll give you maybe these coefficient values, and you then have to interpret a 1 unit change in your x variable. So 1 more passing touchdown would increase the length of a contract by 0.2, and I'm guessing we measured this in years, right? So be a little more complete here. So I might ask you to make an interpretation of a coefficient. Okay? What if I was interpreting age here? What would that be?
Additional year of age is a B3 impact on.
Yep. So if for every additional year in age, the length of the contract would go up or down by whatever this is. Now, if we had to guess, what do you think is probably true about this sign? Yeah, right. So I might ask you, thinking about the relationship, do you expect it to be positive or negative? Right? Here, the older a player gets, probably less likely they already get a very long contract. Now, what if I did maybe I think that there's like some discrimination going on, right? So if I thought that, what if I set up this 1-0 variable that just measures, were they a non-white player? Right? How would I interpret B4? So whenever we have a 1-0 x variable, the 1 unit change is going from, the 0 to the 1, or the 1 relative to the 0 group, right? So a non-white player relative to the 0 group, which would be a white player, we would predict the length of their contract changes by whatever B4 is. So if we do have discrimination going on, what would the sign of this likely be? Yeah, if they're a non-white player relative to a white player, the length of their contract is shorter, holding constant all these performance variables, right? So that would be kind of how we would investigate evidence of discrimination, right? Including one of these dummy or indicator variables. Now the 1 unit change is going from the 0 to the 1 group, or said differently, the 1 relative to the 0 group. So know how to kind of interpret these different coefficients for if you have a 1-0 variable or continuous, right? Where you have actual units. On top of that, the only other thing would be if I give you kind of that output, we might want to do things like which of these have a significant relationship. I would have to give you the p-value. If your p-value is less than alpha, remember, we always start out assuming these slopes are equal to 0. If I can find a p-value on a coefficient estimate less than alpha, I can reject that null. If I'm rejecting that there's no relationship, I'm saying I found evidence that there is a relationship. Okay. What was a good measure we said we had also of how well a regression is, or how well our predictions or how good our predictions will likely be? Yeah, so we also might want to kind of look and think about the R² of a regression. If it's closer to 1, that means we're explaining a higher proportion of the variation in our Y or dependent variable. So we always want to kind of have this higher R² closer and closer to 1. What's one way we can increase R²? We said just including more variables, right? And why does including more variables sometimes change our estimates? So like, let's say I run a naive regression, I obtain an estimate for B1. I then run a regression with more controls. B1, what are we doing when we're adding in more controls? Just eliminating the bias that exists that we might be picking up originally with a naive regression. This might be picking up the effect of a lot of other things that we didn't include. As soon as I include those in my regression, I'm holding those factors constant, right? So it's like saying 2 players who are both non-white or white, both have the same age, both have the same rushing touchdowns, but one of them got 1 more passing touchdown. We would predict the length of the contract goes up by 0.2. So by adding in more controls, we're just eliminating some of that bias that might exist in our coefficients.
Let me see one more thing here, but I want to show this to you. So I think I want to make sure I hit on, since you guys showed up here, I want to make sure I hit on all the things that would be very important to know. And I did write the exam, but my memory's not perfect. So, so we got discrimination. I mentioned that. Yes. 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 Make sure there's nothing else here. Okay. So I think that should be pretty good. The only other thing that I would mention is thinking about competitive balance effects, but those answers are going to be a little bit more difficult. So I'll point out kind of the problems that are good to think about. So where is this at? So maybe like 1, looking at the answer key for that one, thinking about how it is like sharing money that you receive from bowl games or tournament that we wanted to look at. Sometimes it affects overall competitive balance. Sometimes it impacts competitive balance within certain conferences. Maybe conferences that within the Power 5, it would impact competitive balance a little bit differently than those not in the Power 5. So I might give you some examples where I ask you questions like that, where you've got a change that's made, and you have to think about how it's going to impact competitive balance. Maybe if it's not in the context of college, across divisions, maybe across the entire sport. I might even ask, what about just across the teams at the top of every division, or sorry, every conference? So kind of going over this one would be a really good one to know as well, kind of what those competitive balance impacts would be from changes made by sharing revenue versus not, or I shouldn't say sharing revenue, sharing money given from like tournament success or college playoff success. And we talked about some of those before, and there's I think homework 3 has some problems that are good to review on that as well. But other than that, that should hit most of our stuff, right? So it's heavily going to be labor market, right? That's what we've really been looking at that a lot. Yeah, anything on those homework
questions, fair game, anything, when you see in these practice problems, anything that we've kind of worked through here over the last two class periods, would also be good. Other than that, I think the questions can be. So I mentioned one more thing. I think I mentioned it, did I mention you guys filling out the evaluations on? Okay, I said I was only gonna mention it one time, but I would really appreciate it. I don't know, I think I've kind of mentioned it here before, but this is my last semester here at Ball State, so I'm really trying to take everything that I did here and like try to be better moving forward. So the one thing that really helps me a lot, like I will go fill out the numbers, like those matter, I guess, but when I always look at is the comments, right? So anything that didn't like, things that you might change or something, you know, any comment that is in any way potentially useful to me, I really appreciate. So I think those close out the other day on Monday. So if you go and get that done, really appreciate it. Other than that, I look forward to kind of going through guys, all of your projects. Those are due at the end of the day today. So I should start trying to get through some of that grading this weekend, and you'll start seeing those pop up on Canvas. Okay. Any other questions for me before you have them?
No class Monday, right?
Yeah, so no class Monday. Oh, I'll put up an announcement though. If you want to meet Tuesday, I'll be around all day. I just want to schedule people to stop by so I don't have like traffic jams and like a bunch of people at once. So if you want to meet, stop by Monday, even if it's like a couple of you want to stop at the same time, as long as it's like overlap, I don't mind, right? So if it's like two people in this class, I'll schedule them at the same time. I just don't want to have like stats and all, you know, sports going on at the same time and try to schedule it out Tuesday. If you have any last minute questions, feel free to email me. I can answer via email. Otherwise, like I said, I'll be around Tuesday. Our exam will be Wednesday at noon, and I'll put a reminder up on Canvas about the time and the date, and it will be in this location. Okay. Any other questions?
All right. You guys have a fun, safe weekend.